Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I am Helen Harrison with the Northwest Eco Building Guild. I'm on the SLAM Summit Conference Planning Committee, and I have with me my husband, John Harrison, who is going to be a support role here for this session. Just a quick note on making this presentation easier to view. You can minimize your chat screen off to the right, top right corner by clicking the green arrow and minimizing the chat screen, and then you can make any image larger by clicking the 4 arrows in the top right corner of your screen. I'd like to take a moment to honor the land we currently occupy. On behalf of the Guild, we acknowledge that we are all on traditional land of the first people of this region. We honor with gratitude the land itself and thank the tribal people who have been faithful stewards of the land, water, and ancient history of life. Here in Seattle, we are occupying the land of the Duwamish. Peace, dignity, and equality on a healthy planet. This is from the United Nations, is simply stated, but deeply resonates with our committee as we think about you and the need in our communities at this moment. We believe that you are the group of people to set an example for how to support one another and move through this time together to arrive in a better place. Next, I'd like to thank our sponsors. We're starting off with our sustaining sponsors, King County Green Tools, Dunn Lumber, and Pharos Creative. They've been extremely supportive in what we're doing, and we're happy to have their support. Next, we have our supporting sponsors, too many to mention, but we couldn't do it without them either, as well as our contributing sponsors. All of our sponsors help make this event possible, and we thank them greatly. Before we get started, we also have just a few more housekeeping notes. When we finish our presentation, you'll see a floor plan like this picture here. I think by now most of you are familiar with using Remo, but if not, please ask someone at your table for help. If something really doesn't seem right, many problems are resolved simply by moving to another table or leaving the meeting and coming back in. And if you're having mic and camera issues, there are 3 bars in the upper left corner where you can check your mic and camera settings. For help from one of your hosts, you can look for the yellow star like you see in the enlarged image on the right. Any of our hosts will be able to help you out. I'm excited to introduce our speaker for this session, Brian Rich. He is a LEED BDNC accredited historic preservation architect and is a subject matter expert on resilience. Brian has a bachelor's degree in architecture and a master's degree in historic preservation certificate, where his work has focused on future-proofing historic structures. His research has been published in several articles and can be found at principlesoffutureproofing.com. Brian, please join the virtual stage by turning your mic and your camera on, and we will get started.
Great. Thank you for the introduction, Helen. I really appreciate that. It looks like we're done with the AIA required presentation stuff, so I'll go straight into my presentation here. And so today we'll look at the connection between adaptability and right off to a good start here. Ecologically sensitive design. I started looking into the subject a long time ago and realized that over the last couple decades, we spent a lot of energy focusing on obvious connections between historic preservation and sustainable design. I probably don't need to remind this crowd of what Carl Elefante said, which was that the greenest building is the one that's already built. The image of the gas can building here that came along 40 years ago, still relevant today. In 2015,
Brian, yeah. We're not seeing your screen yet.
Oh, my bad. Okay, hang on. I didn't do the share screen. That's my problem. I'm so sorry. Okay. There we go. That's going to be a little bit better here. We'll go back to that presentation now. Thank you, Jenny. I hope that solves it. I'll go back to the image of the gas can building just so you guys get a good laugh out of this picture here. In 2015, I participated in the AIA Resilience Summit in Washington, D.C., and we came out with a whole lot of interesting answers out of that. One of those was the qualities of resilience and what it included. Today, the AIA has a webpage on resilience, and it focuses a lot on disaster assistance, climate change, and hazard mitigation. Not as much on sustainable design, because even at that point, sustainable design was something that was quite common. In my research, I went beyond this concept of resilience to look into what it meant and found a broader understanding of that. Two aspects of it here. They define resilience and then they define adaptation. And what I found was that adaptation is actually an aspect of the resilience of historic buildings, because that's what would allow a building to continue to endure. Following that, I thought, okay, well, I want to develop this further and understand resilience better. And because I felt that the definition of resilience at the time didn't really encompass everything that I was looking at, I chose to call my area of research future-proofing. So where does future-proofing come from? Where did I come up with the terms? I'll go through some of this briefly. Future-proof is a term that I found to be commonly used in many, many, many different industries, including those listed here, and used in a whole bunch of different ways. But there were a lot of common attributes or characteristics in the use of the term here. And so we looked through, I looked through all these and tried to determine some of those common factors that eventually would become my principles of future proofing. Certainly in climate change, there were some key aspects here. There are a few other aspects to it for me in terms of sustainable preservation. That was another term that was used out there. Again, finding more common attributes here. Meg Hassar has some interesting stuff to say there. In fact, the middle quote I like quite a bit. Long life, loose fit is a great strategy. The Steam Plant Square building that's in Spokane on the left here is a great example of long life, loose fit. They've renovated that building to be a retail building with a lot of different businesses, from restaurants to shops and stuff in it. But the way it succeeds is that they don't try to cram retail space into every square inch of the building. They do it where it's convenient, but then they also allow the historic appearance of the inside of the building to be part of the ambiance and the atmosphere there. In other related industries, one of the interesting things that comes up in real estate especially is the four ways in which things can be obsolete: physical, functional, aesthetic, and a new, at the time, a new version, sustainable obsolescence. Any of those particular aspects you might look at and say, okay, is something physically obsolete because it doesn't meet the current, it doesn't have good condition and it doesn't work. Functional is it doesn't work for the purposes it's intended. Aesthetic obsolescence is obsolescence because we just don't like the way it looks anymore. Sustainable obsolescence is the newest version, which is, hey, this building or this object isn't sustainable enough, and therefore we need to get rid of it and build a high-performing building. The picture on the left is an illustration of a functional obsolescence. This is the I-5 bridge at Skagit River, across the Skagit River up in Arlington area. A truck struck the supports of this bridge, and it collapsed. We call it functionally obsolete because it didn't meet the current design standards for lane widths and vertical clearance on the bridge. In urban design, we can look at resilience as well and see a bunch of different aspects of it there. In the preservation and conservation world, there's some really interesting ways of looking at it. And one of the key things that I took from this is the George Morse quote, that the historical evidence and vestiges must be decipherable. That played into a very key aspect of future-proofing for me. The Bernard Fieldin quote in the first bullet point there, mise en valeur, modernization without adaptive alteration, is another important concept for me again. We also look at how interventions affect the historic buildings or historic structures. In this case, what ideally we want is to preserve that historic character while making a building future-proof and adapting it to the new uses. The Brooklyn Bridge here is an example of long-term service life. And it was originally intended to carry 4 lanes of traffic. Today it carries 6 lanes of traffic, pedestrians, and 2 train tracks, and still functions well as a bridge. So out of all of this, the question became, is there a coherent set of principles for future-proofing, and what are they? And is there a definition for future-proofing that we can develop? In fact, I did develop a definition for future-proofing here, and you can read it for yourself there. It's a broader understanding, I believe, of resilience that accounted for a lot more of the potential causes of a building's demise. At its essence, though, it is a respect for and acknowledgement of the cultural heritage value of an existing building that balances those modifications and adaptations that are necessary for a building to be used continually into the future. While I developed and wrote the principles, this definition and the principles of future-proofing in the context of historic buildings, we find today that it is equally applicable to new construction, renovations of non-historic buildings, as well as renovations and restorations of historic buildings. During this research, I came up with this particular phrase. I've adapted it a little bit for this particular presentation. Abandoned and unoccupied buildings don't often have a lot of value to people. When you're living in a building, using it, that gives the building value. When the building's lived in and used or adapted, people will care about it. And when somebody cares about that building, they will take care of the building. That will continue its occupancy, its use, and maximize the service life of a building. Too many times we've seen older buildings that aren't being used that just get demolished. And that's a shame and a waste of building materials and all the energy, embodied energy that's gone into it. So then I went on to develop the principles of future-proofing, and in this you'll see a lot of the different characteristics that I looked at in the former slides here. We're going to focus on a couple of these principles in particular today. Indeed, we're going to focus on principle number 2, stimulating flexibility and adaptability. And I think we're going to touch on a couple others of these principles here. By the way, as Helen mentioned earlier, these principles and definition, as well as my other research, is posted on a website that I created called principlesoffutureproofing.com. No punctuation or anything. You can also get to it probably by Googling Brian Rich and future proofing. So what does future proofing mean when it's applied to historic buildings? Well, the problem is often that structures fail or are demolished because they don't meet the current quote unquote needs. This again is the functional obsolescence of buildings, sometimes also characterized as sustainable obsolescence. Over the latter half of the 20th century, there's been an increasing focus on purpose-built structures, i.e. buildings that are built for one particular use, and they are not built in a way that can be used for other functions or uses or occupancies. And there's increasing pressure to deliver more space for less money and increased deferred maintenance. The high school shown here is one over in Spokane. It received a recent renovation, but something seems to have gone wrong. As you can see in the inset photo, the glazed terracotta is having significant deterioration issues within a couple of years of the building opening, or reopening, I should say, after the renovation. And it's likely that something significant changed that caused the accumulation of moisture under the glazing of the terracotta. Well, once the glazing spalls like this, it opens the terracotta to moisture intrusion, and you begin to get accelerated deterioration. So future proofing of a building means the careful consideration of any intervention in the building that extends the long-term service life, but like in the medical world, we want to do no harm to the building either. We don't want to cause accelerated deterioration of the building. Interesting. Okay, so sorry, I thought I had an image for this slide. When I was doing my master's degree, I had a chance to take a life cycle assessment class with Professor Kate Simonon at the UW. She's probably somebody y'all know. And I chose a project that intentionally compared the life cycle impacts of new construction with preserving historic buildings. And there were a lot of kind of interesting, surprising results that came out of that study that I did. You'll understand in life cycle analysis the impacts of a building that go into mining and refining, fabricating, delivering, and installing materials for a building. That's the left-hand side of this particular diagram. The right-hand side is using the facility, maintaining it, renovating it, and ultimately end-of-life cycle demolition and waste from the building. I developed the term first impacts, which refers to all of the phases on the left. These are the impacts of a building development as you do that mining of the materials and refining it and converting them into building materials. So in this particular project, what I was doing was using a recently designed gymnasium as part of a project that I'd worked on as something fairly simple, but that I could get my head around it and have multiple different types of buildings here. I'll show you the different kinds of buildings here as I thought about it. The building that I had worked on is the one in the top left. It was a 1960s gymnasium with concrete columns and heavy timber wood beams across the roof and then exterior walls. By comparison, some of the other projects that I have worked on and used in this analysis included in the top right a gymnasium that had a slightly different construction system. And then in the bottom left, you see a gymnasium that has brick and stone and concrete structure to it. And then on the right is a gymnasium that happened to be CMU wall construction with trussed roof frame. And the point is here to say, okay, what are the carbon impacts of these different types of gymnasiums? What sort of impact? Is there something better to do in terms of design of a new gym or preservation of an old gym? And what I did was I said, okay, let's assume a 200-year lifespan for these buildings. And how many times would you have to rebuild a light wood frame gym or renovate or update a more durable building construction system? I then used Athena to calculate the impacts for the life cycle of each gym. And we'll show you some of the results here next. One of the additional questions here in the wood frame gyms is about biogenic carbon. And that did come into play as a consideration here. But we'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. So in this first slide here, what I'm looking at is a comparison for 200 years of the first impacts, the impacts that are involved in creating the raw materials and the building materials, transporting them and installing them on site. This diagram, it measures 7 different potential aspects of the environmental impact, and they're all normalized to a relative scale. So they're comparative to each other. They are not literal numbers. And they're on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 at the center and 10 at the perimeter. Now, each of the different colors, the bright blue around the perimeter, purple, green, red, those represent the different types of gym construction. And you see that in the legend at the right-hand side with some general description about what the different construction techniques are. In this first scenario about first impacts, not surprisingly, light wood frame gym construction is far less impactful than that of gym type D, the concrete and brick and stone type structure. When we go on to look at operational impacts for a gym, here we see that the light blue shape with the X's, the maintenance on a concrete and highly durable gym, is pretty much significantly less than any of the other types of construction. With one exception, which was the eutrophication potential. And then what we begin to look at in the third scenario here is a combination of first impacts and operational and maintenance impacts. As this graphic makes clear, Gym A and A1, the wood frame gyms, are at the center. They still have the least impact of any type of construction. So at this point, I'm looking at it and I was saying to myself, well, I'm a preservationist. I love those old brick and concrete and stone gymnasiums. They're durable and can last forever. And I was beginning to get concerned about the argument for sustaining these buildings and renovating them. So I took it one step further and I said, okay, if I have an existing gym type D, is it better to maintain that gymnasium and renovate it, or build a new light wood frame type gym. So I compared a new type A and type A1 gymnasium, and then maintaining, operating, and renovating the other gymnasium types. And this yielded some really interesting results here, in that it was clearly much less impactful to maintain that gym type D that I like so much. Now, the wood gym type A and type A1 are still at the center here, and they're looking pretty good until you stop to consider that that wood gymnasium does not have a 200-year lifespan probably. It's probably 40 or 50 years. And so now you're having to rebuild that wood gymnasium multiple times in a 200-year time span. And when you begin to account for having to rebuild that wood gymnasium multiple times, and the financial and social impacts that that has, as well as the loss of historic character, it becomes a much less desirable solution. So my conclusion out of this was that if we have old buildings that are built out of durable materials, it certainly seems to be beneficial to save them. Sorry, I'm going to go back here for just a moment, because there was another, I wanted to introduce the next part of the slide here, which is that those multiple renovations of a wood theater, wood construction gymnasium that you would have to go through might be part of a cycle of construction and adaptation of a building. And it's a little bit hard to tell sometimes, but our built environment does go through cycles. And I began to look at this in terms of the adaptive cycles and a framework for those adaptive cycles that is called panarchy. In the heyday of a building's lifespan, we don't really focus on its future or its decline. We focus on the thriving success and the vivacity of that period. For people during the Roaring 20s, like we see here in this image, it was life as usual. Even as historians and historic preservation architects, we document the significant aspects of our past. We look back to identify those important moments and put them in the context of broader historic events. Even so, we don't necessarily focus on those transformations or the cycles that the built environment experiences over time. Well, C.S. Holling was a researcher, now passed away, but in his heyday in the 70s and 80s, he developed the concept of panarchy, which is the framework for adaptive cycles. It's equally applicable to ecological and social systems, and I believe also to building systems and building environments. You can see there the definition of panarchy and adaptive cycles, and we'll look into this a little bit more. But as a cycle, it helps us to understand a little bit about the phases in which a built environment is in, or a specific building, and how and where we might be able to benefit that building as designers of our environment. This basic diagram is the diagram that was used by Holling and his associates to explain what this is. There are 4 phases to the adaptive cycle, starting with the bottom left, the entrepreneurial exploitation of the resources that are available. You begin to work on that and create something, and then the cycle moves to the top right corner, or conservation, where you're trying to keep what you've got and keep it in good condition. Well, that conservation phase is that heyday of a building. And we often see that as you slide off and down on the right side of it into the release phase or creative destruction, that's when a building can either end up being unoccupied, demolished, and we lose it, or we can creatively readapt that building. And we as architects can then take and go into the top left quadrant and reorganize the building, reorganize its assets to optimize it for a new and different use, and then set it on its way again through the exploitation and conservation phases of a cycle. There are three potential types of change after the conservation phase. One is that abrupt and destructive change that can be like hurricanes or things like that, or just abrupt demolition of a building. We can have incremental change, which are smoothly and fairly predictable and can conserve it, or we can have a transformational change, which changes the building into something which is highly valued and able to be reused again. Is it possible to totally stop the deterioration of a building? No, admittedly it is not. But if we can make those incremental changes or those transformational changes to a building, then we can keep it. The other thing to understand about adaptive cycles is that there are multiple scales of cycles. You can have large, slow cycles, which are global, or medium-sized scale changes, which might be on the size of a city or even a neighborhood, or very small cycles, which are reflective of a particular building or a part of a building or something. This last diagram, I apologize for the quality of the image, but it puts the adaptive cycle into a three-dimensional perspective, which adds some understanding of resilience in it. Potential on the left sets the limits of what is possible for a building. Connectedness is the degree of independence of a system. Things that are more independent move to the right. And then resilience has a lot to do with how long a building can be in that consolidation phase before it slides down into release. So if panarchy is the framework through which we can understand adaptive cycles, then future-proofing is one that we can understand sensitive rehabilitations that help us work through that release phase of the adaptive cycle. And we can spur the sensitive rehabilitations and breathe new lives into our historic built environment. So what do adapted buildings look like? I'll give you some examples from projects that I've worked on here. The University Heights Community Center shown here is a former elementary school in Seattle, and it was adapted from that public school to being a community center. And now that they have below market leased space for music, arts, and theater programs, as well as 2 schools and daycare facilities. But they have done very, very little to alter the historic appearance of the building. This is a fairly sensitive adaptation of the building to the new uses. And another example of long life, loose fit, long life. The tenants in the building live within the classrooms, and there are not major modifications to those classrooms or to the hallway spaces that are outside that. Another one, this is Guggenheim Hall at the UW that I worked on with Bassetti Architects. This was an interesting project in that we preserved the exterior of the building and the historic character there, as well as the main auditorium. But much of the inside of the building was heavily renovated and rejuvenated to accommodate the aeronautics and astronautics program. Here we kept highly durable materials that would last for a longer period of time. And we increased redundancy of those building systems while decreasing the potential obsolescence by updating the concealed building systems and fortifying the building through structural seismic retrofitting. The Arsenal building down at Camp Murray, south of Tacoma, was originally built in 1916. And it was indeed an arsenal for storing of weapons and materials for the Washington National Guard. But it was later converted into the museum that documents the history of the Washington National Guard. Today, its collection includes artifacts and memorabilia, including weapons, uniforms, and diaries, and has several military vehicles on its campus. You see on the bottom right the nose of one of the tanks that is sticking into the picture there. I believe that's the M47 Patton tank. Another example is the Clarks Creek salmon hatchery down in Puyallup. This is a before picture, which shows the boarded over windows and painted over glass block of this mid-century modern hatchery building. As part of a treaty agreement with the Puyallup tribe for the expansion of I-5, this hatchery was renovated to expand its salmon production as well as trout production to better restore the fishing population that's in Clarks Creek, just behind the fish hatchery here. This renovation provides better experience for the public so that they can learn more about the fish hatchery process, but yet it maintains the historic features of the building that make the building unique and such an unusual mid-century modern building. The Southwest Seattle Historical Society's Log House Museum out on Alki in West Seattle. It was first a stable. It was the stable building that was adjacent to I just blanked on the name of the other building out there, but about 2 blocks away is another building that's a log house building. This one was moved and became a home for a family out there on Alki, and then more recently was purchased by the Historical Society and has become both their museum and office spaces for the building. One last example here for you. This is the Oriental Theater in Chicago, which I started working on in 1994. At that point, it had been abandoned for over 16 years and totally unused. It was originally built as a vaudeville theater, and we adapted it and expanded the stage and incorporated new technologies for theater production, including lighting, rigging, and sound system, as well as other patron amenities like expanded restrooms and concessions in the lobbies, without compromising the character of that historic space inside the building. The Oriental Theater is now a lived-in, loved, and lasting space at the heart of Chicago's historic theater district. At this point, I'd like to look at some different ways of considering buildings that will help to understand the capacity for adaptability of the building. The 5-10-50 analysis is a tool that I learned looking at school buildings to better understand how those buildings might be adapted in the future to different pedagogies or different ways of teaching students. And so what we looked at when we did these analyses, we looked at 5-year, 10-year, and 50-year building components. And those are relative scales of how easy or significant a particular aspect of a building is and how it can be changed or modified for a building. to make it adapt to that new use. And you'll see on the right here a list of some of the different aspects which might fall into a 5, 10, or 50-year analysis of the building. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a series of floor plans and analyses that I've done, and you'll understand a little bit better how to apply this. The first example I've got here, this is a Louis Kahn designed house, the Esherick House. And Louis Kahn, in many ways, with his designs of servant versus served spaces, separated, I guess, the 50-year building components from other building components, which would be less permanent and less fixed in place. When we look at those fixed components, they're largely gathered into 2 areas on each floor, and they focus around the elements which are entries, major circulation elements like the stairs, kitchen and dining area, kitchen areas where you're going to have lots of plumbing and electrical stuff that's difficult to move or relocate, and similarly bathrooms, which has a lot of plumbing stuff and is typically very difficult to move or relocate. In this case, the 5, 10, 50-year diagram is very, very simple in that we pretty much have 50-year components and not 50-year components. Another plan from Louis Kahn to look at, again, fairly clear in some of its definition. This one happens to be the Richards Medical Center, which is, again, designed on the servant versus served concept. And what we can look at here when we analyze it is we see that stairs and fixed vertical shafts are fairly well concentrated into specific areas that are the shaded red rectangles. The unshaded red squares are building envelope and structural components, which are also typically 50-year building elements because they're quite difficult to change. In this plan, we see perhaps one 10-year building element in the green hatched area in the top left, which is a wall separating 2 rooms. That might be able to be altered fairly easily in order to double the size of that space or connect the 2 spaces into one. I'll show you a couple of plans of 5, 10, 50-year analyses that I've done as part of constructability reviews for school projects. By comparison, the red areas on this plan, which are the 50-year building elements, I focused on those. They're outlined in red, and they tend to be kind of scattered all over the floor plan. And so when you begin to see along the walls braced frames that would block a connection between classrooms, or plumbing systems that are much harder to relocate or move, those limit the ability to connect classrooms or to change spaces for different teaching pedagogies, or just a different use for the building altogether. And so we look at that and we say, well, this is a particular challenge maybe for the school district in the future who owns the building. They may want to reconsider how they design the building to allow for much more flexibility. Similarly, this is a much more casual and quick 5, 10, 50-year analysis. All of the building elements that are 50-year elements are shaded in black in this particular analysis. I just did this as a tracing paper overlay on a floor plan. And it took me all of 10 or 20 minutes to do this diagram and to understand what I'm looking at here. I circled several items in red on this particular floor plan to emphasize that these are aspects of the building that really constrain the interior flexibility of the building. So you have braced frames between classrooms, restrooms, along the hallways, plumbing chases and electrical chases that don't make it easy for you to combine classrooms for team teaching or create project learning spaces. And so as we do this, you can take this concept and just overlay it on your plan fairly quickly and understand, hey, maybe we need to make something, to change something so that a plan is more adaptable or flexible for the building in the future. In conclusion here, why is that 5, 10, 50-year study indicative of sustainable design? It's that critical tool that analyzes the ability of a building to be adapted to future changes in use, future changes in how to use that building. And that's directly applicable to sustainability through the conservation of the materials and the reduction in construction carbon footprint or first impacts. I'm going to turn now to operational impacts, and we're going to look at a couple ways that building design can reduce operational impacts and how buildings are maintained over time. Some of you may be familiar with the Repair Manifesto. This is something that I became familiar with in my research on future proofing. Why are we going to look at this? Because the Repair Manifesto is an approach to all human-made objects that calls for them to be able to be repaired and to endeavor to repair them rather than dispose of them. So it's a movement against a disposable society. As sustainability experts, if we don't know about the Repair Manifesto, I would argue that we should, because it's directly focused on the reduction of waste and how things can be designed to be reused and extend long-term service life. Some of their principles here about repairing, from my point of view, the key item here for sustainable design is the last one, that Earth has limited resources and we need to be efficient in our use and reuse of what we already have. A number of their sayings about the benefits of the Repair Manifesto and repairing existing things. So what does this have to do with buildings and sustainability? Well, we already talked about the limited materials and being good stewards of those materials. But one of those critical aspects, I think, of the Repair Manifesto is designing for disassembly. And not just from the point of view of disassembling at the end of the service life of a building. I also mean disassembly from the point of view of making repairs or adapting a building for new uses. There are several components to consider with that. And part of the issue, I think, that we've seen during the COVID-19 era in particular is we've seen stifled material production because people can't make things because of all the restrictions for COVID-19. And that's resulted in some soaring material costs. I just learned this week on a project that I'm working on that wood material prices are going to be have gone up over 100% in the last several months. And that's because the lumber mills can't get people there to produce things. They've got a number of people that are sick. And that's on the supply side. On the demand side, Home Depot and Lowe's and a lot of those do-it-yourselfer stores are going crazy with sales because people are at home not able to do their work, and they're seeking the opportunity to do modifications to their homes. So it's caused a huge demand. The price increases may ease sometime in 2021 as people are doing fewer and fewer projects, but it doesn't seem to be too likely. So I'm sure you've read through these at this point, but if you'd like to understand more about those key components, you can just do a quick Google search on design for repair, and you'll find more information on these guys. Other considerations in design for repair. There's certainly a conflict between designing repairable items and selling new items because people want to sell new items to generate revenue. But there's also issues around how well will a repaired product function? Is it going to be safe and secure? Is it convenient to repair? And is the overall quality of the product good? There's some question about potentially sharing trade secret information and the tools that may be necessary for diagnosis and understanding the repairs, completing the repairs of any particular project. And in a technologically based society, aging technology obviously becomes obsolete. There's, of course, security having to do with consumer information. If it's an electronic device, how much of our personal information is on there? But back in the 1980s, when I was in high school, this is a disassembled Volkswagen Beetle. I actually did a project when I was in high school and took the parts from two Volkswagens and merged them together with a few new parts, like an engine block, and developed a roadworthy Volkswagen Beetle. Well, that is a car that was designed for repair, designed for being able to be fixed, and was low tech enough that I could do it myself. One of the other concepts here to consider is not just design for repair, but again, design for disassembly. And often we look at this from the point of view of cradle to cradle or end of life results of a building here. We as a building industry have millions of tons of waste from our buildings. So can't we plan for that process, for that end of life? Of course we can, and we know we can. In end of life, sometimes it takes products and materials and recycles them or upcycles them into new materials. But at the same time, we're also designing for disassembly. We can also be designing for easy repair and maintenance. Again, another statistic there about the amount of waste that we have in the building industry that just simply goes to waste. And I'm going to come back to some of the things that that I mentioned earlier and tie together obsolescence and adaptation of the buildings, and some of the reasons that buildings are just simply demolished. Some people may look at a building from the 4 forms of obsolescence. Some may look at a building from the point of view that it doesn't remain useful during the adaptation process. So there's some period of time where a building is offline, if you will, and maybe not earning revenue. And there's also some concern that a new building will minimize the risk of obsolescence in the future. And then some people just look at it and say it's easier. Okay, I don't quite agree with that. How does this all relate to sustainable design? Obviously, if you can have building components that can be repaired and refinished and reinstalled, you can extend their service life. if you have modular or systematized, standardized building components that can be removed, they can be removed and reinstalled in a expanded or different part of another building. And then last, of course, the disassembly of a building allows for parts to be accessed and repaired so that the building could last longer in its current place. One of the other interesting aspects of disassembly of a building is that it could be disassembled in one location when it's reached the end of its use there, but not the physical end of its service life, and it can be reassembled in another location. I'll share with you a few projects that are not mine, but that I discovered online when I was doing my research on the topic. The website heritagebarns.com features disassembled and adaptively reused barns. It's really interesting to me because their designs are sensitive to and feature many of the key elements that make barns unique, such as the heavy timber framing, cupolas, and other windows and other building components here. This particular barn that you see on the screen now was originally built in 1890 in Maryland and has been disassembled and restored in Texas. Another example from the same website, this particular barn, you can see from the interior shot, the heavy timber beams that were used there, but you also see that the roof structure, the floor, the white walls that are in between the timbers there, those are modern interventions that were sensitively done that allowed the biggest and best features of the timber frame to continue to be on display in this adaptively reused barn. This particular barn, now in Texas, was originally built in New York in 1820. So it's almost 200 years old at this point. But when you look into these kinds of buildings and disassembly, you have to look at a few things in particular. Material selection, as well as how parts are put together, are very, very important. You want to find materials that are long-lasting, durable, non-toxic, and have a good possibility for being recycled. You have to look at those connections in the building and consider how this might be taken apart and whether the pieces that you're taking apart can easily be reused in the future. One of the other aspects to consider is the building systems, mechanical, electrical, etc., and separating those systems from the main structure in a way that you don't compromise the integrity of those major building materials. The other aspect of MEP systems is that they're often shorter service life parts than structure. And you want to look at how to replace those shorter service life components of a building without having to do major damage or alteration to the building structure and other longer service life parts. Oftentimes, modular design and standardization of the building components can help a lot with easy replacement of those parts. So at this point, I feel like I've blasted through my presentation here, but I would like to open the conversation to questions and discussion. Helen, I believe that's your cue.
Oops, it seems like Helen may be having some trouble getting up on stage, so I will ask you questions.
Okay. Yeah, it looks, I'm seeing some of those problems in the
Q&A?
chat.
Oh, so the first question with 2 votes is, how do we encourage design for disassembly? Do you know of good resources you to?
Ooh, very good questions. How do we encourage design for disassembly? I think one of the great ways to encourage things is, of course, financial impact for design. And when you begin to look at design for disassembly, you can look at the long-term, what do I do with the building later on? Can I sell the parts? Can I get some financial benefit out of the building at the end of its life? And if we can make a convincing financial argument to an owner that the building could either be disassembled, moved, and relocated, or disassembled and modified in a way in the future, that is, those are likely some of the best arguments that we can make. Depending on your client, you may be able to argue that, of course, disassembly and reuse of materials is more sustainable. Some owners will definitely have a focus on that. Do I know of good resources that I can point you to? The website, when I did my research here, I was just researching stuff on the web, and I keyed in design for disassembly or design for repair. And those were some of the best sources that I had on that. I will offer for you a thought about, I just lost my thought. I apologize.
Yeah, that's okay. I think people are just looking for resources to back the argument, right?
Yeah, understood.
So you recommend Googling.
Yeah, that was where I found my best information. Mm-hmm.
Great. Next one is, I love this idea of 5, 10, 50-year diagrams. How do you see this applied to single family homes or residential apartment buildings?
Okay. Really good question, and an interesting one. As I consider a single family home, part of what I'm looking at there is if I'm going to sell the home in the future to somebody that might want to change or adapt it, what are the things that I can do to make that more appealing? And can I advertise it to a new buyer? For instance, many homes will try to concentrate bathroom and kitchen functions in a certain area to concentrate the plumbing and stuff, and leave other parts of the building a lot more available for renovations. That seems to be quite a good strategy there. Residential apartment buildings get to be a more difficult issue because you're dealing with multiple different units that people are living in. But again, if you have 2 units that are adjacent to each other, you could focus on all those fixed elements in there a lot easier. Another way to do it would be to consider designing the building with structure that has more permanent structure and over longer spans. So residential apartment building, we often see that post-tension concrete slab construction with reinforced concrete columns at the perimeter at the core. That allows a lot of flexibility in the middle of the building to change the layout of the units themselves, so that you can change it maybe from a 1-bedroom unit to 2 or 3-bedroom units, or revise a floor plan. For a single family residential building, that can be a little bit more difficult, just because sometimes that cost of getting to that structure is a little bit harder. For me, though, as I look at my house, I know where the load-bearing walls are in the house, and I know that I can insert beams and columns to open up spaces for modifications in the future.
Great. Next question. What about defunct land use like retail centers and suburbs? i.e. future move to higher density?
An interesting question. And usually if you're looking at something that's a retail center, a shopping mall, or a strip mall looking to adapt the building, you may well run into issues where the desired configuration for the new building doesn't allow you to adapt the property. But I would offer that there is probably a way to take that retail center and add a second story to it, while not getting to highest and best use, would increase density of the building and allow you to earn more revenue on that property.
Thank you. There's a question from me. Can I steal the repair manifesto for Sustainable Ballard?
With
our followers.
Yeah, Sustainable Ballard's a great organization. I live in the Ballard area, so I know about it. And the Repair Manifesto is not mine. I did not create it. I found it on the internet when I was researching resilience and future proofing. So I would offer it's open to adoption with whatever appropriate credits go there for the authorship of that information.
Yeah, especially with people who are active in the local tool libraries. I think that it would be fun to share with those folks.
Yeah.
All right. So we don't. Oh, here's another question.
Good.
Excellent.
Please keep them coming. I appreciate it.
Coming. Yes. Any consideration about buildings in floodplains or other compromised or soon to be compromised land use?
Floodplains are an interesting issue because we have, from the beginning of our human occupation of the planet, wanted to develop properties or homes, buildings, in an area that's convenient to the resources. We have, as a species, grown up around the shorelines and rivers' edges. And so those were some of the earliest areas that were developed. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on right now in research about how to adapt buildings for climate change. And especially one of those is sea level rise and dealing with the flood-prone areas that we live in most. Sometimes those are understanding that you just have to elevate a building and build a structure under it. Damming walls around a building is another kind of unfortunate way to do it there. I'm sorry, Jenny, there was a second part to that question, which has
now gone away. It was floodplains or other soon to be compromised land.
Other soon to be compromised land. I wonder what that might include.
Well, I imagine what you were talking about, anything that's compromised by climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. Anything that's compromised by climate change. I'm also thinking of other natural hazards or natural disasters. If you're in an earthquake-prone area like we are here in the Pacific Northwest, you can make adaptations to a building to withstand the earthquake requirements. And those kind of seismic retrofits are things that I've done on other projects. Some of the examples of the projects I had included seismic retrofits.
Yeah, Geo followed up saying he was talking about places that might return to natural habitat or have climate change risk. Yeah.
Returning spaces to natural habitat is always challenging because if you own an area that's subject to some sort of environmental challenge, whether it's floodplain area or a seismic zone, you're giving up your land. You're giving it up to a natural purpose and returning it to that natural resource that it was. But how do you, as an owner of that property, accommodate the economic impact to yourself? It's a very
you can get you can sometimes get a covenant on land that'll reduce at least your taxes if you do that kind of restoration.
Sure, and you can also, you can also put your land into a conservancy. But does that mean that you can't live there anymore? Does that mean that you can't modify or change or improve the property? Yeah, usually it does, and that is an economic impact to the owner of that property that you have to be willing to give up.
Brian, given your historic preservation work locally, can you talk a little bit about how that process plays out for a building in Seattle that people may want to take steps to preserve?
Really interesting question. There's a lot of people shy away from preservation from the point of view that you might have to designate your building as a landmark. And once you do that, there are certain controls that are placed on it. I want to encourage everybody that is working with old buildings to please go ahead and designate your building. As a former and current landmarks commissioner for King County Landmarks, and now I'm on the Redmond Landmarks Commission, I want you to know that it is not a bad thing, and designating a building does not mean that you can't touch a building. Regardless of whether you designate a building or not, the steps are very similar to it. In my mind, you want to look at the building and understand what about the building is important from a historic point of view, and then you want to look at what parts of it are flexible and you need to change. From my point of view, it's not just saying, hey, I want to change this. It's understanding, okay, how hard is it to change it and what are the possibilities? Frankly, anything can be done with a historic building or an old building. There are ways to get around structural issues or plumbing issues in any building. So don't be afraid of that. What are the next steps to doing that? Likely you want to find somebody that is an expert in working with those historic buildings and understands how you can do things, and they're not shy about it because they've done it before. They can then advise you and make suggestions about how to do those kinds of projects here. I see another challenging question coming.
Yeah, do you have an opinion about Spud's Fish and Chips in Green Lake that didn't receive historic preservation / landmark status?
I know of that building. I know of the project, and I know that it didn't receive its landmark status. I have to be a little bit careful because I don't understand exactly why it didn't receive that landmark status. It is likely that when you designate a landmark, let me back up a half second. There are certain criteria that you have to meet for the building to be considered a landmark, and those are largely what is the function of the building in terms of its historic place? Is it a well-known place? Is it historically significant from the point of view of its design or the occupants or the users or the designers on the building? And I don't know what basis it was nominated on. Even living in Seattle for as long as I have, I actually didn't know about Spuds before it was nominated, and then did not get nominated. Or did not get designated, I should say. Excuse me. It's a really interesting question.
It is quite a landmark. I think a lot of people love it.
Yeah, so it's interesting that it did not. In the city of Seattle, that recognizable building in the local area is an accepted designation criteria. Similarly, Manny's in Ballard was the Googie Architecture Restaurant at the intersection of Market and 15th. That building did get designated, but in the city of Seattle, there's a two-step process. You designate, and then you also establish incentives, or controls and incentives as part of the process. And what happened there was, while Manny's was designated as a historic building, the Seattle Landmarks Preservation Board did not establish any controls against the demolition of the building and the preservation of its historic architecture. So it was thus demolished.
So there's a really interesting question from Geo. Do you foresee a status for keeping a building because it's viable? So like a viable preservation rather than historic preservation is what it sounds like to me.
Absolutely. I mean, any sort of existing building can be kept and renovated, remodeled, if you want it to be. Is there like an official status for that because it's still viable?
If it's maybe if it's scheduled for demolition and the community wants to save it, it's not historic, but it's a viable building, and that's the scenario I'm envisioning.
Yeah. Okay. So likely if a building is old but still viable. Okay. I see Geo's adding future status to protect a building. There are provisions in the Seattle Code and other codes for extraordinary significance of a building. One of the criteria for designating buildings age, and in the Seattle area, that age minimum is 25 years. In other jurisdictions, that's 40 or 50 years. So you can designate a building that's less than that age if the building has a really extraordinary significance to the history of the area. And I'll give you an example, which is the Space Needle here in Seattle. It's actually a privately owned building structure, and it was designated by the city of Seattle as a landmark well before the 25-year threshold for its eligibility came along, because it was such an important part of the World's Fair and such an important landmark to the city of Seattle. But is there a status for keeping a building because it's still viable, or a future status to protect it? Probably not. And the reason is because when you designate a building as a landmark, it is considered to some degree an imposition on an owner. And there's a concept of a taking by the federal government that you can't by law do. The justification for designating a landmark and putting those controls on it is that there is a significant public benefit to having the building there, and understanding the history that surrounds it and how it plays into the community and its importance to the rest of the community. So if a building is viable but maybe not otherwise meeting the age criteria, or some of the other designation criteria, there's not going to be a protection status for it, because that would be considered a taking by the city or by the state.
Great. Well, it looks like we may have run out of questions for you here, Brian. Let me turn on my camera. So I'm gonna release folks back to the tables. Everybody, we encourage you to go visit Brian at the table that has his name on it when we close this up. And also want to remind everyone that we have big plans for our closing session tomorrow. Lots of opportunity for you to meet new people. We'll have a yoga session. We have a closing inspiration speaker as well. So we want to encourage everyone to join us at that closing as a positive alternative to the debate tomorrow night. So, we'll see you all on the floor.
Excellent.